Welcome to the SWIKE Podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SWIKE Podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We are here with a special guest host, Patrick. Patrick, how are you doing?
Good, Luki. How about yourself?
I'm phenomenal as always. So Pat's a good friend, and he comes to us with a background in technology, computers, supply chain consulting, a whole bunch of things. So Pat, what would you say that you're up to these days?
Well, that's a good question to start with. I think you summarized it pretty well. I would describe myself as a technology consultant who is focusing on procurement technology, transformation, as well as the process enablement. Now, that's just another way of saying that I usually work with organizations to implement, their buying and procurement system according to what works best, and also incorporating their respective particularities. That hopefully summarizes what I do pretty well.
Yeah, and summarizing for the kids that don't really know tech or supply chain, it's helping companies buy and sell better, kind of a nutshell. But
yeah, that sounds right.
So that's a little bit of what you're doing now, but we'd love to rewind and go back in time and ask, what were you like as a kid? So what are some early fond childhood memories when Pat was a wee little one back in the day? So what were you like as a kid?
Yeah, no, this is a good question because I do often reflect, and sometimes I myself wonder how I got here, right? And I think, by the way, appreciate the opportunity for inviting me on this podcast, because sometimes this is also a good thing to discuss. So what was I like as a kid? I consider myself, somebody who was quite lazy. I was spoiled. I recall being a procrastinator and very disorganized. This is when, as you know, I was born in Indonesia, and I could never really finish my homeworks in time. Things just seemed to be moving really fast at that time for me, and I just couldn't keep up. Was never a top talent in my class of 42. That was a ranking system there. Never made it top 10. I think I made it 11 at some point, but that was it. that was as far as I could go. Okay. But, had a good circle of friends, and, they're all are better than me in terms of ranking. So I always felt like I was, the weakest link, I guess, at that time. Right. So that's my stage when I was in Indonesia. I was before I was 14 years old.
Yeah. So growing up, what were some of the influences along the way? So I presume, I hope, parents weren't the lazy, spoiled procrastinator types. And it's not just that you were surrounded by them. But then what was the influences that kind of helped you get out of that as well?
Oh, many, right? I think there are three primary influences in my life, and I was just speaking about my younger days. But along that journey, in high school, I met a really good circle of friends who I learned discipline from, right? My parents obviously played a large role, but it didn't really, it's different between being told what to do versus seeing an example, right? Of someone like, this person is close to my age, and he or she is like, I can relate to that person, right? And they're doing better, they're diligent, they never have to be told what to do, and they just do their work. So that's the circle of friends that I kind of ended up surrounding myself with. And obviously, there's also the career kind of social circles, right? Where I think from there, I learned to be more confident from the nature of my work, because as you know, I was part of the consulting group, right? And that kind of put me in front of strangers and situations where I had to speak publicly. It's always and a big learning experience as well that comes along with that. So I think from there, I learned to be comfortable with kind of rolling with the punches, so to say, right? When there is a situation where you're not familiar with, first time around, your tendency is always to pause and and panic and worry probably about the things that you don't really need to worry about, right? But from there, I think, enough of that will tell you like, okay, what matters and what are distractions. So I think I became more confident from that angle. Yeah.
I'd love if you dug a little bit more into your younger days. So it sounds like that you made a transition because you had a good circle of friends. And I'm reminded of the quote, something like that, you are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So it might be a good cue for folks out there, for the young ones, to do an audit on your friends to say, like, do I actually want to be like these people? Or can I spend an extra hour hanging out with someone with the qualities or the traits or characteristics that I want to emulate and be like? So it sounds like that's a good cue. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that high school experience and like what prompted you to get into like computers. Like, were you always like the tech geek that was building their own computers, video games and stuff like that? I know for me, I was a little bit into that. And I'm wondering if you can share your experience on getting into computers.
Yeah. Okay, that's actually a really good question, because I think when, we're at the same age, right? I think when we were starting, computer was just becoming something starting to become a hot thing to learn about, right? How did I get into computers? Did I know about it? To answer that question, absolutely not, right? Like, I didn't even know until much later in life, after high school. When I was in high school, the only technology course we had exposure to was keyboarding, right? Okay. there wasn't anything programming in my high school. I think I might have taken a side course for that, but I can't remember exactly. But I'm pretty sure we didn't have a class for that. So I originally, I was influenced by a couple of friends who wanted to go into business. It felt like something that was like in at the time, right? Want to go into business or economics. So I kind of followed the path. I was more of a follower at that time. I just follow where the crowd goes. But as I graduated high school, I did really well in economics and accounting in high school. But when I got to university here, University of Toronto, first year economics and first year accounting, I completely botched accounting, especially, right? So that's kind of like the wake up call that I might have been picking something that I wasn't either good at, or I wasn't going to be good at, or I wasn't interested in. And I think at the time, I happened to my friends happened to be interested or part of the computer science program, and that's again I end up following them just to see how it is, right? So I think it's about sometimes you just gotta fall, right? Like, you guys gotta fall to realize that maybe this is not the path I want to take. Yeah. And I just happened to end up liking programming and technical. I think I kind of funny thing is that I should have known that, because I was into video games. I always into like understanding how that works, right? Like, I read magazines and articles about programming. I just never dawned on me that, hey, maybe this is something I want to look into.
Yeah. I think a couple of things come to mind is that failure, I think, is important, where I think there's a quote to the effect of failure is part of success. Yes. So it's not the opposite of it. So you need to make sure that you do fall down once in a while. And then the quote that recognizes that sometimes after the fact you can connect the dots, but along the way it's a little bit harder to do that. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more on that transition. So you mentioned you grew up in Indonesia and ended up at U of T. Was that always the plan for you to go to Canada? And then talk a little bit about the transition into that business program, or the choice between that, if you could.
I think there's an overarching theme here that this is going to be there's a lot of surprises in my life, and about rolling with the punches. So no, I did not expect to somehow move from Indonesia all the way here. I think it's like a 2-step process too. So Indonesia was a school of, where classes were 40 students large, and you're just a number, right? There's barely any, I guess, intimate interactions between you and the faculty, right? So you never really got that attention, right? I think somehow one thing led to another. I wasn't a good fit. I was not doing well. And that's when I moved to my high school in Singapore, right? So it was pretty close, but still I moved at a very young age. It was, I think maybe a little bit too young for somebody to move away from my family at the age of 14. But I think it's something I also am glad happened, right?
Okay.
Because that school was very small. So we had a lot of interactions with our teachers, right? So there were like a lot of good advice resonating. I think that's the relatable, I should say, not resonating, relatable advice, because they know how to provide it to me now that I look back, right? Like they can seize the moment. They can act on, the situation. So I think that was really the key. Like I finally realized, okay, this is what it means to learn, right? To understand something. And then from there, that was a Canadian international school. So I think from there, it became a lot easier to move into a Canadian college, Canadian university is where I ended up. Again, I was following my friends. I didn't really know where I was going. I didn't know what I wanted to specialize in. And then a couple of my friends went to University of Toronto. I'm like, okay, yeah. Toronto sounds fun. Let's do it.
Sounds good. I think it connects back to the importance of surrounding yourself with good friends, because had they gone up to different things, I'm sure you would have different adventures. But it still would have been different. So sounds like that moving to the high school in Singapore was a great move for you with some of those friends.
In disguise, I would say.
So you learned some of that discipline. You got some very relatable advice.
But
and then you ended up transitioning to you.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off. I wanted to call this out. I think it's also about being ready to act on it, right? Like, and I had a supporting, a very supportive family member, because you could you're a parent. I think for some parents it might have been difficult to let go, right, of someone so young, even though it's only like an hour plane ride. I don't know how it is in this day and age, but at the time, my family was quite traditional, so there were, a bit of conflicting opinions about that. But I'm glad it ended up that way. So there were people who were supportive of me, and I was able to take advantage of it. So I think that was also key, having the mentality to be able to react to it, in a positive manner, sort of, and picking the right thing to do.
Yeah. And we'll probably need to talk to your mom and dad and have a parenting advice version for this. But it's always helpful when you have supportive family members or just supportive people around you in general in order to help you through that.
It's blessing in disguise combined with obviously luck as well, like meeting the people that I met over there in Singapore.
Sounds good. So now we're in Toronto. You started I guess a business program, but got like punched in the face in economics and accounting, and realized, computers is a better fit. So
punch in the face.
How was that experience? Go through kind of the last few years of university, and then obviously we graduated around the same time when the .com bubble didn't do so well, and tech was really in shambles. So what was the transition from like school to the work environment like?
Yeah, again, this is interesting. Now that we're having this conversation, I'm realizing how lucky I am. University to the workforce. So I got my job not through the regular screening channel, right? Like I think, as you know, we usually have to submit resumes, attend recruiting events. I did none or very little of that, in fact. So the reason I got into my primary work what's the word I'm thinking about? My main job at the time, right? Because there were a lot of side gigs that I did. So I helped with teaching a programming course. I worked part-time at a retail store while waiting for work. So I didn't get my job right away. So I didn't get my real, feels bad saying it like a real job. Every job is a real job. But my main job, I didn't get it until like 6 months after I graduated. So there was a bit of a waiting period. And I got that through networking. Okay. It's an easy version of networking. It's just through my friends. And these are friends whom I've worked with during university who knew my capabilities, right? Because we were working together on a project. She knew how diligent I was, how I take pride in the quality of my deliverables. So I think she was confident enough to vouch for me for this company, right? And one thing after another, I was hired as initial a contractor. They ended up liking working with me, and I just, got the offer for a full-time employee. So, it was one of those things where now I look back like, wow, I don't think I could have survived the 2-3 rounds of interviews where I had to compete with hundreds, probably even, thousands of candidates, if not for this, So I think that's I try to emphasize that, I think, to people I meet, or those who are entering their careers or early in their careers, like just never underestimate networking, especially, don't associate networking with just the professional circles. It's also your friends, right? Like who knows how you operate in a business setting, in a professional setting.
For sure. Yeah. And it is great advice to the students out there. Stay connected, be connected with all of your classmates.
And never underestimate that.
Yeah, I think the important part here is that you really want people to understand your capabilities and your abilities, because there's the networking where like, hey, can you submit my resume, right? Versus the networking where, hey, how I operate, how diligent, how awesome I am. Do you think I would be a good fit for your team? That's a very different sort of networking.
Yeah,
and I think that was the key piece where you had a classmate who knew how you operated and could vouch for you. I think that's the part that a lot of people miss, where they're just hoping for someone to hand in their resume or submit a piece of paper. But without that backing behind it, the reference and recommendation, then it doesn't go as far as you would hope.
Yeah, and something just dawned on me when you talk about it that way, when you look at it from those two angles, right? Like one of that example is like active networking, you're submitting resumes, right? But the other, I guess, advantage about the way my version of networking, and it's not to say that you have to pick one or the other, but there's that angle as well, where it's somewhat passive. You are doing this, you're showing your capabilities because you had to do work, right? Like you were doing something else and people see the output. That's just like part of your day-to-day. It's supposed to be part of your day-to-day activities, right? Like network through that as a byproduct of your discipline, byproduct of your, your diligence, right?
Yeah, I think it's call it networking through good work and just kind of showcasing. One analogy that I use is there's that philosophical idea of like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? So most people have heard that. But I usually say, if you did a good job and no one knows about it, did you really?
Yeah,
right.
That's a good point.
Because that's one of those aspects where, yes, you don't want to be a braggart and you don't want to be arrogant and talking about yourself. But if zero people know about it, like you create the best research paper and report ever, but it sits on your desk.
Yeah.
Well, then like nobody knows about it. So people need to be out there. And sometimes that networking part about the passiveness, sure, you need to do good work, but someone needs to know about that. And I think that's a lesson I learned later on in my life.
Oh, man,
I just thought good work would recognize.
I can already see my brain going, where I was going with that discussion is there is also the opposite side where ultimately when you become senior enough or not even, right, like mid-level, you have to be able to recognize that a tree fell, right? Like, or you have to be able to recognize because that's on you now to help elevate others, Like sometimes you're just, I have met a lot, I think I don't want to say the average person, but most of the people I've met through work is more like, okay, get the job done. You did it well. That's it, right? That's the extent of our relationship. But there are others who, are willing or understand that promoting my good work or recognizing it is important, right? Not only for my career, but in the long run, it will help them as well, because if I can do some more of something, they get to do either less of what they do or do something that, they some other things that they want to do. So, oh man, I know my thoughts are all over the place. I do enjoy this podcast, by the way. All right, I'll stop.
It's good. So I'll like turn it back to you now landing a job. You contracted full time and are starting to go through this journey with a consulting firm. So walk us through a couple of key milestones in there that you recommend, maybe some of the lessons learned along the way, and then you're ultimately now in kind of the contracting space. So out of the full time consulting, but let's walk through some of those kind of key milestones along the way.
Yeah, a lot to unpack. I'll start again with the fact that coming into consulting was not in my plans. Heck, I didn't even know what consulting was when I first joined. So I don't know if you realize that. But a lot of this was about, it's another level, another stage in my life where I have to learn a lot, right? So I think one thing's for sure, I actually would recommend consulting for those of you who share my I guess background here, where I'm not somebody who actually knew what I was going to do right out of high school, right out of college even. I think somehow ending up in consulting allows me to just explore and see other things, right? Because it's a project-based approach, or at least the consulting that I was in is a project-based approach where you go from one place or one team to another, right? Learning about how one group or one person interacts and what they do, right? Now, I get it. I'm part of this one space of sourcing and procurement, but I think it just happens. I know people who have moved around, right? Like yourself as an example. I think it gives that, it encourages you to look around, right? Like be aware of all the differences that are around you. So I think that's the one message I wanted to say in this segment. I think consulting also taught me quite a lot of things in terms of, again, going back to what I said, just rolling with the punches, right? Like it's a lot of work. Some of them are quite intense. And I think I was put into a lot of situations where I don't usually know who I'm going to work in it right off the bat, right? There were a lot of projects with different team every time. And as a matter of fact, I think every project, I remember thinking at some point, like, how come I never get to do the same thing twice? To the point that it almost annoys me that every time I go into a project, I have to learn something new. Right? I can never be good at something or be excellent at something. But in the end of the day, looking back, that was actually, I think, one of the things that I appreciate, that I felt like I was lucky to be able to not only experience, but just endure. Part of it is enduring all that stress,
For sure. And for me, I would share that same sentiment where when I landed a job in consulting, it was, again, through the same method, through networking, obviously a different person, through different circles. But I didn't know what consulting was. But now it's quite pervasive. I thought I was joining an accounting firm. Yeah, so the kids these days, or the folks that I talk to on campus, they know very well what consulting is because they've done a good job in terms of branding themselves. And a couple of things is it seems to be the new place to go to when folks don't know what to do. Because I get messages where like, I want to go to consulting so I can figure out what I want to do, right? Because as you said, you get a whole bunch of exposure and exploration into various different areas of business, technology, or whatever. And with different teams, with different industries, with different whatever. And from there, presumably, you can kind of narrow down to say, okay, I like this type of work, I like this type of area, this type of domain, and potentially choose from there. So I think it's a great place to do that. But I've also heard that consulting, like a year in consulting, is like 2 years in industry, mainly because instead of working 40 hours a week, you're working 80.
Yeah, and you do new things, right? Like not new things, but you don't do the same things that entire time usually, right? In the project setting. Yeah, totally.
And the way that the system is built is that those at the ground level doing the work, they have to learn the work for like 40 hours and then do the work for like 40 hours. So that hence the extra time period. So there is a active amount of learning that's there now. Consulting firms have recognized that, and they have adjusted the work-life balance. But there is still an expectation for you to learn extra. So if you want to do the same things and over and over again, consulting is definitely not the place for you because they will challenge you and get you to learn.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. It's not for everyone, right? But I actually will go a step further and encourage, where they can, encourage those who are just starting their career to give it a try, because I think once the biggest thing I realized throughout my career here, I mean, a lot of my project has to do with transformation, right? So it's essentially what that means is we're asking people to change the way they do certain things, whether it be for the better or the worse. But change is hard. I think this is, a phrase that gets thrown around quite a lot in our project. Change is hard. That being said, if you're part of consulting and you're into this kind of like these project modes where maybe you're not doing the same thing more than once or twice, I think just, passively, your mentality is used to reacting, to changing, to, again, rolling with the punches. And I think that goes a long way, because less things will phase you, right? Like change will not cause any panic or stress. And I think that's what I learned about myself. Like, I'm not afraid of, what am I getting into kind of thing, because I know at the end of the day, this is exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to have to learn, and then we'll figure it out along the way. I think it's, I noticed that's one of the things that I, inherited through that ordeal, through that gauntlet.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote, the only constant is change. So be prepared for that, that things are going to change no matter what. And for those students out there that want to give consulting a try, you can look at one of our previous episodes. We had Dan Marquez, who started the University Consulting Group. So that's an organization that helps or brings students into kind of the consulting world and gives them support and mentorship in order to learn that. And for those that have already graduated, there's Endeavor Consulting, where it's not students, it is experienced professionals, but you also get mentorship from other consultants so that you're not kind of left.
That sounds interesting. Yeah, that sounds interesting. I don't know if we had that during our day and age, right? Like when we graduated.
No, I think they were founded fairly recently. So again, I didn't even know what consulting was, but now more and more people are very readily know what consulting is. And it seems to be a very kind of go-to area. So again, as Pat recommended, give it a try. It may or may not be for you, but at least give it a shot.
And as far as Pat's recommendation goes, no coming in that it's going to be intense, right? Like I think you and I both know that there's not a lot of people who kind of survived our team more than a couple of years, which is fine. Sure. Nothing wrong with that. But I think that's an indication that it can be, at least when we were there, it can be stressful. And I think, like you said, I would imagine that they want to, they've changed for the better, right? In the early years. Always want to retain good talent.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of sets up for the next stage. So if you can share a little bit about the transition out. So you're not working for the consulting firm anymore, and you're kind of off on your own. What was that transition like to get into the contracting world?
Wow. I was always a follower, as I said before. And you know where this is going. So for those audience who don't know, Luki and I are very close. We started consulting together. And as we did joining together, when Luki left, not long after that, probably even a few minutes after that, I also left. How did I get into contracting? I think it's also because well, that's one factor. But I think through that journey, I realized what I like to do, which is I don't like to be managing people. I can, but I don't want to get that high, right? Like, I actually like doing things. I like development. I like the programming. I like I actually like the business analyst kind of work where you interact with the business to understand what it is that they're doing. And I try to relate to them. So I wanted to stop at that level. Not stop, but at least I want to expand that layer, right? And it didn't really kind of occur to me that the nature of consulting that they always try to push you up as well, right? And I think this is fairly true for most industries. They always want to move up. I think I was very comfortable at some point. I got to this point where I was a technical lead and a functional lead, and I really liked that work. And then I started becoming a project manager, right? It's like, I don't know if I actually like this. I want to do the coding. I want to do the development. I don't want to be like managing project plan and stuff like that. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I just didn't really enjoy doing it. So I think that's also a compelling reason why I decided to go for contracting, because then I can focus or advertise or brand myself as somebody who's, an expert in this area, an expert as a functional lead, as just an advisor, right, in that area. So yeah, I think that's the reason why. That would be like the main reason why.
Yeah, what I took from that is that society or kind of typical career paths are up and to the right, right? More and more management. Yeah. And I think there's something called the Peter principle, where you are promoted up to the level of your incompetence or dislike.
I like using that term.
Yeah. So in the sense that you realize that, well, I actually don't like the managing of people part. I actually like the doing part of it. And I actually thought in my career as well that there were a few times where I thought I wanted to be demoted, right, to get back to doing the work. Because sometimes when you're up there, then it's a little bit too kind of strategic, but too fluffy and not really tangible. Yeah. But there are different paths where you can stay down that course. And I know some consulting firms are doing pretty well in terms of keeping folks, but it is the expectation, like overall, the firm wants you to move up and become a partner and stuff like that. Whereas for folks that want to stay at a level, again, they're doing better in that, but it's a little bit challenging to combat that.
It's interesting. I'm actually not sure if this is kind of like the consulting way, right? I almost want to feel that that's the case, because maybe in industries, they're a bit more. There's obviously not as strong of a push, right? I think it was more cultural in consulting, where you're trying to move up, right? Or everybody else around you is moving up, so it's kind of strange for you not to, right? Like it just didn't feel right to want to remain where you are. But I think maybe in industry, it might be a more tolerant or just more common to do it that way. So constructing. Contractor is not the only path if you want to do that. Yeah.
Well, I think the culture is still there. It's often on a slightly different time scale, where, like I said, the 2 years in consulting is 1 year in consulting is 2 in industry. It's almost accelerated at that same pace. It's still, at least in my experience of folks that I speak to, there is still that drive and that pull. But because the time scales are a little bit lengthened, then the expectation to move in there. But I guess it depends on the path and the culture. And as we kind of close off this episode and get into some of your SWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier. I know you shared a lot of it, like kind of rolling with the punches. It's definitely a theme there, surrounding yourself with good people to follow. And are there any other messages that you want to emphasize or share as part of the stuff I wish I knew earlier, or advice to the young Pats listening out there?
That stuff. I think it's more about taking the time of recognizing your situation. I don't think I do that enough. That's a little bit. I find that even that phrase a little bit abstract to me, but kind of ties into the whole point why this thought, right? Like there's a lot of stuff I wish I knew earlier is even happening. It's just we never really thought about it that much when it's happening. So I think the advice I give is, take the time to breathe. They take the time to really think of, my situation, what just happened, right? Like, am I in a good spot? If there's anything better out there, why certain things happen, right? They usually there is a reason behind that. And I think it's important to take the time to really, just reflect. I just don't think I do that enough. And I think if I do now, I would be more comfortable with myself. I think when I was young, I was a very insecure person when I was young. I probably forgot to mention that part. Right. But I think in general, it's, again, in the spirit of, maybe we should title this podcast like Rolling with the Punches. In the spirit of rolling with the punches, in the spirit of just being able to react, you always want to make sure you are equipped to react to the situation. So like, get the basics right. I think in this day and age, from a knowledge perspective, where we live in a technology world, so some kind of basic understanding of the technology of your math skills will be highly important going forward. I think even having that gives you a leg up, right? A lot of the surprises, I think, will have something to do or will require that skill set. Less about, video game reference, less about knowing how to craft survival items, but more about being able to respond to these technical challenges, I think. Yeah.
Sounds good. So what I took from that is taking the time to breathe. So just taking the time, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times we're in this kind of go society. What's next? We have to do things. But like taking a 5-minute breather, like enjoying an afternoon on the weekend or a whole weekend or a whole week, right, to yourself to ponder, like, are things going the way you want it to, or are you on what I call like the conveyor belt of life, right? Because people go through and they go to high school and boom, you get your degree, and then you go to university, boom, you get your degree, and then you go get your job and you get married, you get all this sort of stuff, right? So taking that time to think is important.
The hard part is actually reflecting on the negative part. Because when I do that, there's always this part of my brain, right, that is almost afraid to face it. Like, because let's say I did some terrible mistake or I was embarrassed for an event. I can't recall right now what it is, but there are times where I sit down like, oh man, that was embarrassing. And then I just stop, right? Because your brain just doesn't really want to go there, doesn't want to relive that. But I think it's okay. You just have to acknowledge that it happened. And take the time to think, you know what, maybe I could have done something better. Or it could be the other way, like, oh, you know what, that happened for a reason. It wasn't my fault. There was nothing I could do about it. And you move on, man. It's just like, it's that, it sounds simple, but I totally can relate to the challenge because, it's just human for you not to want to relive I guess, for the lack of a better term, the trauma, right? The trauma of embarrassment.
One quote has helped me a lot. It comes from Shakespeare, of all places, in Hamlet, where they say, "For there is nothing good or bad, and thinking makes it so." So if you actually take a look at whatever that so-called trauma is and say, well, how could that trauma be the best thing ever? Or that was the best lesson that I learned. That can be super important. And you can do that with the help of a coach, with the help of a therapist or whatever. I think more people should take the time to think.
That's true. And then, like a sounding board, somebody to just, bounce it off, because it's tough to think about something like that when you're like distraught, right?
For sure. Yeah. And in terms of like rolling with the punches, again, probably an apt name for this episode. But I guess figuring out the different skills, whether it be tech skills, whether it be stopping procrastination, or maybe it's just surrounding yourself with great people so that you have people to emulate and people to follow that will put you in a good spot in the future versus, well, if they weren't as diligent or as productive, then you might have ended up in a different path. So I think those are great lessons. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about kind of future aspirations. What will you be up to the next little while? And then where can folks connect with you if they want to reach out?
I don't know, Luki. I'm comfortable where I am right now. Now, I actually, there's some truth to that, right? Like, I think I like to think that, the reason why things happened to me, like all these rolling with the punches, like all these surprises, like it led me to this point where I actually I can't recall when the last time I felt like I needed to do that. Like I can't recall the last time I was put in a situation where I was like, okay, I have no idea what the heck I was doing. So I'm at a comfort level. So I consider it, you could be right. This could be kind of like a stage in my life where I just rest a little bit before I move on. So in terms of future aspirations, I think it's more about, I want to try to help others just like you, Luki. Like just, in maybe some subtle ways to give the right advice. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that can be beneficial and valuable for them in the future. And I think in terms of contacting me, or for those of you or those of your audience who wants to understand a bit more about all the transitions that I've gone through, who would like to relate to that experience, they can reach me at LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest place. Kingman Patrick Wardhana, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, we'll link them up into the show notes.
We'll put my email in your cast.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Pat, for sharing your SWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier, and having this conversation.
Oh my God! Thanks for having me. This was fun. This was fun.
Sounds good. And again, there's so many different nuggets that we could deep dive into, but we wanted to keep this episode just as an intro. But hopefully, we'll have you back for a future episode.
Thank you, Luki.
All right. Take care, Pat.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE, Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.